When I was thrown out with a trash bag, I swore I'd make my stepfather pay. 12 years later, I kept that promise. I never planned to post, but the last stretch finally shoved me past silence, and I need to put words to air before they choke me. When I was 17, my mother married a man who loved polished surfaces and hate disguised as humor, and she packed us into his world like luggage. He said he ran several local ventures near Phoenix, and he wore that claim like a shiny badge whenever anyone asked why he acted like a king. My sister Lily was 13 and nervous around loud voices, and I had learned early to make mine sound smaller than it felt. Mom, who I'll call Carol because that's who she became, chased status like it might stop time from touching her face. Richard liked to smile while giving his own kids phones and speakers, then ask if Lily and I felt blessed to enjoy electricity. 9 months after their first dinner date, we rolled our lives into his stucco palace at the edge of the desert, and the echo in that place felt like a warning. He kept the air cold enough to see your breath in August, and he claimed that comfort built character because only the disciplined deserved warmth. Madison and Trent got rooms painted by professionals and closets that breathed cedar, while Lily and I were guided to a spare hallway where the carpet still smelled like solvent. He laughed about grocery totals in front of neighbors, then told me a teenage boy should consider fasting to learn restraint. Carol learned to laugh 2 seconds later than him, which somehow made it worse than if she had started it. You know how some men turn a living room into a stage the moment they are handed an audience, whether invited or not. One baked Sunday, the garage became his set, and the heat climbed like a dare that nobody would quit. 6 metal chairs sat in a lopsided arc facing a whiteboard with all our names, and a cardboard wheel leaned against a cooler like a prop from a failing carnival. Carol held cue cards that looked cut from a cereal box, and her wrists trembled while she practiced the first line under her breath. Lily kept her hair in tight braids I had done that morning, because Carol said salon appointments were reserved for children who belonged. Richard tapped the board with a dry erase marker and welcomed us to his family improvement program, and he played host with the kind of grin that eats the room. He spoke about harmony, responsibility, and fairness, then rolled into something he actually called "Who Gets to Stay," and my stomach climbed into my chest like a trapped animal. Lily whispered that I should tell him to stop, and he heard her and clapped his hands like a showrunner happy with ratings. He said the wheel would choose 2 who remained and 2 who left, because chance was purer than favoritism, and he winked at his own kids like the punchline belonged to them. He spun the wheel with more ceremony than our last 3 birthdays combined, and the cardboard rasped like sand against the peg until it slowed near the line between our names. The arrow jittered, hesitated, kissed both letters, and he gasped like he had discovered gravity, then declared the first double elimination in program history. Madison popped a cheap party tube and flung paper confetti at Lily's feet, and Trent lifted a plastic flute like he had just received a scholarship. Carol read the card that said contestants should gather essentials only, then reminded us that houses are for families, and guests use bags if they push their luck. I told him none of this was legal, and he stepped into my space with that breath that smells like minted validation, and he promised to call officers and report trespassing if we were not gone in 20 minutes. My voice went bigger than my sense for one reckless second, and he pressed his palm against my shoulder with just enough pressure to say he knew the exact edge of trouble. He demanded our keys and started recording on his phone, instructing us to announce we were leaving voluntarily and surrendering access, and he watched my mouth move like a coach training a stubborn player. Lily started shaking so hard her braid ends tapped her collarbone like nervous fingers, and I realized the only victory left was making sure she reached a car. While we packed, Madison walked into Lily's room and scooped the small stones Lily had arranged by color on the windowsill, and she said collections deserved curators with taste. Trent took my headset and a portable speaker while explaining that competition builds character, and winners take trophies to inspire the underperforming. Richard leaned in the doorway counting down every few minutes, and Carol stood behind him reading the same line again because she had nothing left except script. I stuffed Lily's favorite rabbit into a trash bag along with socks and 2 photos of Sam laughing under a crooked porch light, and I told her we were not leaving anything that mattered more than breath. When we stepped onto the driveway with the bags biting our hands, a dented sedan idled by the curb, and Sam looked like the week had been chewing him since Monday. His eyes went to Lily first, and then to the phone in Richard's hand, and I gave him the smallest shake of my head because I needed us in that car more than I needed justice. Richard and his kids posed on the porch with sparkling juice poured to look like champagne, and one of them took pictures like they were documenting a wildlife rescue. The gate clicked behind us, the sun hammered the street, and the smell of hot asphalt became the shape of that afternoon in my memory. Sam said nothing for the first several blocks because he understood that words can bruise when the skin is already torn, and Lily held the rabbit like a life jacket. He drove toward his apartment on the worn side of town, where mailboxes leaned forward like they were tired of waiting for good news, and the air inside the car tasted like coffee and honest sweat. In the rearview mirror, I saw my face and thought it looked older than my birthday claimed, and I decided that getting Lily somewhere safe would become the only measurable task of the day. Behind us, a stucco palace kept its thermostat too low for August, and a man rehearsed applause for an audience that finally left the room. The first night in Sam's place smelled like laundry soap and onions from the neighbor's pan, and the couch clicked when he pulled it open and promised he was fine on springs. Lily and I shared the small bedroom with a rattling fan that learned every rhythm of our breathing by midnight, and the sound eventually softened the edges of my thoughts. Sam handed me a spare key that bent slightly near the teeth, and he said he made extra copies in case locks decided to misbehave, and I almost laughed at the ordinary kindness of that planning. We sat on the floor eating refrigerated noodles out of one bowl because the second bowl was drying on the rack, and Lily finally spoke long enough to ask whether the rabbit looked braver from one angle than another. Before sleep ambushed us, Sam rested his hand on the doorframe and said he was proud of how fast we moved when it counted, and the sentence landed like a blanket. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the wheel, the arrow, the cheer, and the way Carol's eyes wanted to be anywhere except on her children, and I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. I promised myself that I would keep Lily's feet steady until she learned to run again, and I promised something I could not name to the garage lights that had watched us gather our lives into bags. I did not know it yet, but hidden inside Sam's metal file box sat a thin stack of papers that would someday turn that promise into a blade I could finally lift. The second month at Sam's place tasted like strong coffee and drywall dust, and we learned how to fold our days into something survivable without asking anyone for permission. Lily started sleeping with an old sweatshirt of mine tucked under her chin, and I learned the exact creak that meant she was awake and staring at the ceiling again. Sam picked up extra shifts at the warehouse and came home with hands that looked like they had argued with rope, and he still tried to joke that blisters were cheaper than gym memberships. I kept pretending that homework and part-time shifts would build a bridge to somewhere stable, while every headline about layoffs felt like a whisper that bridges sometimes drop you into rivers. At school, the counselor called me in to ask about a behavior plan Richard supposedly designed, and I realized he had mailed a packet describing me as volatile and Lily as manipulative. The language sounded official enough to scare someone who liked binders more than children, and the counselor read lines about boundary testing like she was reading weather updates. I told her our boundary test involved a fake game show and plastic champagne, and she blinked as if her training never covered carnival punishments. A week later, a police officer and a child welfare worker knocked on Sam's door because an anonymous report claimed I hit Lily when she forgot chores, and I watched Lily try to answer calmly while her hands trembled so hard the rabbit's ear wagged on its own. Sam kept himself between the doorway and the living room like a human breakwater, and the officer finally apologized when he saw the fridge covered in Lily's little sketches of constellations taped with blue painter's tape. Richard's reach kept turning up where we breathed, like sand in shoes 3 days after the beach, and I started cataloging the ways he tried to bend the story. Someone slashed the tires on Sam's car the night before my midterm, and a note under the wiper claimed thieves respect families who pay their way. Our upstairs neighbor swore she saw a familiar SUV idling by the curb at midnight, and described a silhouette that moved like a man who likes mirrors. I spent my book money on used tires from a lot that smelled like burned rubber and old rain, and I walked Lily to school the next morning because the quiet felt pointed rather than peaceful. Carol insisted on seeing us at restaurants with chandeliers made to look expensive, and she would order sparkling water and pretend the stemware turned her into someone younger. She always arrived exactly 12 minutes late and left if we were 10 minutes behind, and she bought Lily a bland sweater 2 sizes too large because the store was out of your color. I tried asking for boxes of childhood photos that somehow lived behind locked doors in a house where guests used garbage bags, and she said Richard handled archives because he had a system. The waiter once asked if we were celebrating something, and Carol said family progress while Lily bit her lip so hard I watched the color drain. Money pressed on us like a hand that never gets tired, and every time the rent came due the calendar looked like a dare. I took a job bussing tables at a diner near the bus depot, and the manager called me kiddo in a tone that made it sound like both pity and training. A man in a pressed polo started leaving pamphlets on the counter about career opportunities with flexible entry fees, and he kept asking whether I was ambitious enough to chase abundance. When I said my abundance looked like making sure Lily slept through the night, he called me small-minded with a smile that insisted he meant encouragement, and I decided that some sales pitches are just permission slips for cruelty. Lily's school held a winter showcase for art students, and she had a small corner with a watercolor of a desert sky that looked like it inhaled. I stood 3 feet away while a pair of kids snickered about rumors that Lily once stole lip gloss and ran from a security guard, and I recognized the exact flavor of lie that grows in a household where the truth never given a chair. Lily kept her shoulders straight and explained her colors to a quiet teacher who nodded a lot. And afterwards she asked whether reputations can change if you stand perfectly still. I told her sometimes you change a reputation by living long enough to be boring, and she laughed without humor, but at least she laughed. Sam carried too many shifts and too much worry, and his doctor said blood pressure like a train schedule he had memorized since childhood. He started keeping his old case files in a metal box that clicked when it closed, and he said paper tells the truth when mouths forget how. I did not ask what he meant because men who work themselves thin deserve to keep a few secrets that aren't heavy. On afternoons when the light slid across the kitchen table just right, Sam would lean against the counter and ask me to tell him one good thing from school, and I learned to find crumbs of good even on days that felt like sweeping a beach. The rumor machine spun faster when Madison posted a sunny photo of their holiday trip with a caption about peace and gratitude, and a few classmates sent me the link with emojis that meant pity disguised as entertainment. Trent made an appearance outside the bus depot one evening and told me I should apologize for disrespecting adults who put a roof over my head, and he used the phrase personal responsibility with the certainty of a boy who never paid for toothpaste. I told him roofs shouldn't come with game shows or forfeited childhoods, and he muttered about how ingratitude ruins harmony before climbing into a car that didn't belong to him. We had a night where a pipe burst 2 floors up and water clattered through our ceiling like 1,000 coins skipping across a metal tray, and Sam had to move the couch into the kitchen to keep it dry. Lily and I spent that night on the floor wrapped in towels, and she woke from a nightmare insisting the cardboard wheel was spinning above her head, dropping buckets of confetti that felt like hailstones. Sam boiled tea on the stove at 3 in the morning and told us about the time he slept in his pickup for a week after a hurricane. And he said storms eventually decide to leave even if you forget to ask kindly. I held that line and turned it in my mouth like a lozenge until the panic receded enough to blink. I applied for a small scholarship that required a faculty recommendation, and my math teacher wrote something so kind I actually sat down on the steps outside the office. The committee interview happened in a conference room that smelled like printer toner and cautious optimism, and the final question asked me to describe a moment that tested my character without making me sound angry. I said sometimes restraint is louder than shouting, and one of the panelists smiled the way people smile when they recognize a bruise. The award covered books and a bus pass for an entire semester, and for 2 months the future felt like something I could fold and keep in my back pocket. Then Richard sent Sam an invoice for damages to household morale, a phrase so ridiculous Sam laughed so hard he had to sit, and we understood the laughter was cheaper than legal fees. The letter accused Lily of undermining his parental authority by refusing a hug, and it accused me of theft for removing my own t-shirt from a dresser drawer during the eviction. Our lawyer friend from the warehouse barbecue explained that sometimes clowns file paperwork to look taller, and he mailed a reply that used statutes instead of adjectives. I pinned the envelope above the sink with a magnet shaped like a cow, and I stared at it whenever anxiety tried to do push-ups in my chest. There was one particularly sharp evening when Lily forgot her sketchbook at a bus stop, and when we returned 10 minutes later, a man I recognized from Richard's office was flipping through the pages like he owned her sky. I stepped between them and asked him to hand it over, and he said the public space makes public property with a grin that knew he was lying. Sam pulled up in the sedan with the engine rattling like a box of screws, and he opened the door with a look that drained the air from the man's lungs, and the sketchbook floated into Lily's hands without another syllable. We ate cheap tacos that night at the kitchen table and agreed the salsa tasted like victory, even though it came from a jar that listed sugar first. Lily began therapy through a community clinic that used lamps to make their waiting room feel like a living room, and she came home with breathing exercises that made our apartment sound like the sea. We built little rituals that made hard hours pass more quickly, like reading one chapter aloud and judging every character as if we were old critics, and cooking scrambled eggs in a pan that insisted on burning the second side. Carol kept texting that she wanted to try again as a family if we kept our visits short and our expectations realistic, and every time I almost answered. I remembered the smell of marker ink and the click of a fake wheel. By the end of that year, I could carry 2 ladders at once at the warehouse and not yelp, and Lily had a wall of watercolors that made the apartment feel taller. Sam started sleeping in the bedroom when my schedule stretched too late, and I pretended not to notice because he deserved a door that actually latched. We did not talk about revenge because revenge sounded like a luxury purchase, but I kept replaying the scene in the garage and thinking how certainty can sometimes be a kind of currency. I did not know the exchange rate yet, but I planned to save every penny of patience until I could afford the thing that finally changes the room. I thought the worst of it was behind us, but the storm had only been circling, waiting for the right angle to strike. The weeks after the last blow-up were deceptively calm, like the air right before a tornado levels a street. Lily and I kept to ourselves, Sam buried himself in work, and the phone stayed quiet enough to make me suspicious. Then one Tuesday evening, the silence broke in a way that made every hair on my arms stand straight. A man in a rumpled blazer knocked at our door with a clipboard and a practiced smile that didn't touch his eyes. He introduced himself as a contractor for dispute resolution and said Richard had authorized him to collect on unreturned assets of sentimental value. I asked what the hell that meant, and he flipped a page to a printed list that included a half-used bottle of perfume, a coffee mug with a chip, and, bizarrely, a paperback Lily had checked out from the school library 3 months ago. Sam stepped in then, his voice steady but cold, and told the man he had exactly 10 seconds to leave before we called the police. The smile vanished, the clipboard snapped shut, and the guy backed down the hallway muttering about uncooperative parties. 2 days later, I caught Lily staring at her phone with her jaw clenched. Someone had created a fake social media account in her name and was posting cropped, blurry photos of her with captions about ungrateful teens who bite the hand that feeds. They even tagged a few of her classmates. I messaged the platform, flagged the posts, and by nightfall the account was gone, but not before the screenshots had already started circulating at school. That was when I stopped walking her just to the bus stop. From then on, I went all the way to the school gate, because sometimes safety is just making sure the wolves see you watching them. Sam's truck broke down the following week, and the mechanic said it would cost nearly a month's rent to fix. We pooled every spare dollar, cut groceries down to basics, and made it work, but there was no denying the stress etched deeper into his face. I offered to cover the repair with my scholarship money, but he shook his head and said that kind of sacrifice eats away at you in ways you don't notice until you're hollow. He was right, but it didn't make watching him walk to work in the rain any easier. One night, as we were eating pasta that tasted faintly of tin from the bargain sauce, the power went out. At first, I thought it was just our building, but when I looked out the window, the streetlights were still glowing. Sam grabbed a flashlight, checked the breaker, and came back with a look that told me someone had cut the main line to our unit. We spent the night in the dark, Lily curled up on the couch between us, the flashlight beam sweeping across the walls every so often like a slow, deliberate searchlight. In the morning, the maintenance guy said the line had been tampered with, but wouldn't elaborate. I didn't need him to. I already knew whose shadow was creeping into our space again. Lily's winter art competition came next. She'd been working on a piece for weeks, a city skyline at dusk, the windows glowing like a heartbeat. The morning of the event, she opened her portfolio and found the watercolor slashed clean through in 3 jagged strokes. No note, no sign of forced entry, just a surgical kind of malice. She didn't cry, though. She just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the ruined paper, and whispered that maybe she wouldn't enter next year. I wanted to tell her she would, that she had to, but the truth was stuck in my throat. Sometimes resilience feels like asking a kid to walk back into a fire. The real tipping point came when a letter arrived, not from Richard, but from a law firm representing him. It claimed we owed restitution for defamation, citing things I'd allegedly said to neighbors and Lily's teachers. They attached a demand for an apology, signed and notarized, along with a payment plan. Sam read it twice, set it on the table, and laughed so hard it turned into a cough. He said the kind of people who write these letters are the same ones who think an apology is just another kind of trophy. We burned the envelope in a coffee can on the balcony, watching the edges curl and blacken until the words couldn't be resurrected. After that, everything felt like it was accelerating. I'd see the same silver sedan parked across from the diner where I worked, always with someone in the driver's seat pretending to scroll on a phone. Lily started double-locking her bedroom door, even when she was home alone in daylight. Sam kept a baseball bat by the couch. And me? I stopped thinking about when things might calm down. Instead, I started making a mental list of every single line Richard had crossed, not because I wanted revenge, at least that's what I told myself, but because knowing the shape of the monster helps you see where the traps are. The night before Christmas Eve, Sam came home with a split lip. He said some guy had bumped into him on the street, muttered something about teaching him a lesson, and swung before he could react. Sam fought back, but the guy took off before the police arrived. We didn't need a description to know it wasn't random. Lily didn't sleep that night, and neither did I. The apartment was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet you feel in your bones, dense, waiting, like a held breath. When I finally lay down, I realized that the waiting was over for me. If Richard wanted to keep playing these games, then fine. But I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life flinching at shadows. Something was going to give, and when it did, I needed to be ready to make sure it didn't swing back on us again. By January, it was obvious Richard wasn't content with just scraping at the edges of our lives. He was digging in now, trying to find a vein. Sam's hours got cut at work without warning, and the rumor mill suggested a concerned citizen had made calls to his boss about trust issues and inappropriate conduct. No one would say who, but I could hear Richard's smug voice in every vague sentence. It wasn't enough for him to win in his own mind. He needed us to lose in front of an audience. Lily's school became the next battlefield. One morning, she came home early with her backpack half-zipped and her face pale. She said a teacher pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay at home because someone had sent the school office a stack of printed emails, fake ones, claiming she'd been stealing from lockers and selling the contents. The emails had our address in the signature block and my name listed as the sender. The principal didn't believe them, thank God, but that wasn't the point. Richard was seeding doubt wherever he could plant it, hoping enough whispers would grow into something he could use. I started documenting everything. Photos of odd cars parked too long outside, copies of every letter, timestamps for every phone call. Sam laughed when I labeled a folder or chest, but his eyes told me he understood exactly why I was building it. We'd tried ignoring Richard before. That only made him bolder. This time, if he wanted to escalate, I was going to be ready to meet him there. The real escalation came in the form of an envelope slid under our door one rainy night. Inside was a single Polaroid of our apartment building, taken from the alley behind it, the timestamp burned into the bottom corner. On the back, in cramped block letters, it said, "Close your blinds." I held it in my hand for a long moment before showing Sam. He didn't say anything at first, just went into the kitchen and poured 2 stiff drinks. We both knew this wasn't a threat you could take to the police and expect results. It was a warning dressed like a dare. A week later, while I was working the closing shift at the diner, I spotted Richard himself across the street. He wasn't trying to hide, just leaning against the hood of a car, arms crossed, watching the entrance. I kept serving tables, but every time the door swung open, my stomach tightened. When I finally stepped outside at midnight, he was gone, but a scrap of paper was tucked under the wiper of Sam's truck. All it said was, "This ends when you learn your place." The way the ink had bled told me it had been sitting in the rain for a while, waiting for me to see it. That was the night I called in a favor from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Mason, an old friend from high school, owed me one, and he knew his way around finding things people didn't want found. I gave him Richard's full name, the businesses he bragged about, and told him to see what floated to the surface. Mason didn't ask why. Maybe he already guessed. While Mason dug, I kept the peace at home as best I could. Lily stayed close. Sam worked odd jobs to cover what his paycheck no longer did, and we kept our heads down in public. But inside, I was restless. It's a strange thing to live on the edge of something like this. You get used to fear, but it hardens into something sharper, something that wants an outlet. Then Mason called, his voice low and deliberate. He'd found irregularities in Richard's finances, tax filings that didn't match, property records with signatures that looked forged, a small web of shell companies that barely seemed to exist outside of paper. He didn't have proof yet, but there was enough smoke to suggest a fire worth chasing. My pulse quickened in a way I hadn't felt since the day Richard first shoved us out of his house. Maybe this wasn't just about surviving anymore. Maybe there was a way to turn the ground under his feet into quicksand. Before I could decide my next move, Richard made his. He showed up at Sam's temporary job site, all smiles for the foreman, pretending he was there about a potential contract. In reality, he cornered Sam by the loading dock and told him to convince me to drop whatever I was cooking up. Said accidents happen on job sites all the time. Sam came home late, his hands shaking harder than the coffee mug he was holding. I'd never seen him afraid like that, and it stoked something dangerous in me. I called Mason again and told him to go deeper, to pull everything he could without crossing lines that would drag him down too. Then I opened my war chest and started piecing together a timeline, not just of what Richard had done to us, but of the patterns that might show he'd done it to others. People like him rarely hurt just one set of targets. They move in cycles, finding new prey whenever the old ones are too broken to be fun anymore. Days bled into nights, but the tension didn't break. Then, one afternoon, Mason sent me a single text. "You'll want to see this in person." We met in the corner booth of a near-empty bar, where he slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were scanned contracts, property liens, and one particularly damning bank record that tied Richard's name to a fraudulent loan using collateral he didn't own. I didn't smile, but I felt it, the first real shift in months. This wasn't just about defense anymore. This was leverage, the kind that could ruin him in ways he couldn't fix with intimidation or fake letters. And for the first time since all this began, I felt like maybe the ending to this story was going to be ours to write, not his. I didn't sleep the night Mason handed me that folder, just sat at the kitchen table with the lamp casting a yellow pool of light over the papers, reading each line like it was a map to the future. Every number, every date, every signature told a story of Richard's arrogance, of how sure he'd been that no one would ever look too closely. He'd built his little empire on foundations of rot, and now I could feel the weight shifting under him. By morning, I decided exactly how to use it. Instead of running to the police, I sent anonymous copies of the most incriminating documents to the banks he'd borrowed from, to the property board, and to 3 of his biggest business partners. No threats, no explanations, just evidence with the subject line for your review. The first response came faster than I expected. A curt email from one partner's assistant saying the meeting with Richard scheduled for that afternoon had been canceled until further notice. The next 48 hours felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. One bank froze his accounts pending verification of the collateral. Another partner pulled out of a deal that Richard had been bragging about for weeks. Mason sent me a link to a public notice showing that the property board had opened an investigation into fraudulent filings connected to one of his shell companies. And still, I didn't hear from Richard directly. That changed on the third night. My phone lit up at 11:14 with his name. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the sneer that had been his trademark for years. He said he knew it was me, that only I could have dug this deep, and that I needed to think about the consequences before things went too far. I asked him if he remembered the night. He told Sam accidents happen on job sites. He hung up without answering. The following morning, I found an unmarked envelope in our mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words scrawled across it. "We can end this." No signature, no return address, but the handwriting was his. I didn't respond. I'd already decided there was only one way this ended, and it wasn't with some quiet truce that let him keep even a shred of what he'd stolen. Mason and I coordinated the final push like we were planning a heist. The last piece came from a source I never expected. An email from a woman named Karen who had once worked for Richard as an accountant. She'd been fired years earlier after refusing to sign off on numbers she knew were cooked. She still had copies of everything she'd refused to touch back then, and she wanted him to feel what it's like to lose something you think you own. Her files tied together the fraud, the forged signatures, and a pattern of hiding money in ways that crossed from unethical into criminal. I packaged everything into one brutal packet and sent it to a journalist I knew from the diner, a guy named Jonah who'd covered corruption stories before. He promised to fact-check it all before publishing, but I could hear in his voice that he already knew this was gold. When the article went live a week later, it hit harder than I imagined. Richard's face was plastered across the front page of the city's biggest news site under the headline, "Local Businessman Accused of Years of Fraud and Deception." Within hours, the story spread. The comment sections filled with people sharing their own run-ins with him. Unpaid contractors, tenants he'd bullied out of leases, even a former friend who said Richard had stolen an investment idea. His name had finally become toxic in the exact circles he'd spent his life trying to impress. 2 days later, Sam came home to find me standing at the window, watching a moving van in front of Richard's house. Boxes were being carried out by strangers while he stood on the porch, talking to no one, his face pale and slack. I should have felt triumphant, but instead there was this strange hollow in my chest, like I'd reached the top of a mountain and realized the air up here was too thin to breathe. That night, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Richard was standing there. No smirk, no posture, just a man who looked like he'd aged 20 years in a month. He said he'd come to tell me one thing before he disappeared for good. He admitted he'd hated me not just because I reminded him of my father, but because I reminded him of himself, the parts of himself he'd spent his whole life trying to bury. He said he'd thought crushing me would erase that reflection, but all it had done was make him smaller. Then he thanked me, which made no sense until he added, "You've done what no one else ever could. You've made me stop." I didn't answer. I just closed the door. His footsteps faded down the hall, and that was the last time I saw him in person. A week later, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me for an amount that was almost exactly what my father had lost because of him. No note, no explanation, just the money. I showed it to Sam, and we both knew cashing it would feel like accepting an apology I didn't want. I tucked it in the back of the war chest instead, a reminder that even the people who think they're untouchable can bleed. Months have passed now. Mason's moved on to other work. Jonah's article won him an award, and Richard's name still shows up sometimes in conversations, always followed by a shake of the head. Sam and I finally found a place big enough for Lily to have her own room again. Every so often, I'll catch her sitting by the window, smiling for no reason I can see, and I think maybe we've started to win back something I thought was gone for good. But sometimes, late at night, I'll look at that envelope in the war chest and wonder if Richard meant it when he said he was done. Or if one day, I'll hear a knock on the door and find out that this story was never really finished at all.